Hi folks, welcome back to the Hoard. You guys remember the Honda 300EX sitting right out here underneath this black tarp and so forth. And what I did is I popped for a frame with proper identification and so forth, and I'm about to start moving things over, but what I wanted to do first was decode the ignition system and the wiring system and the wiring harness, and I figured I'd bring you guys along for that, because a lot of times when you buy these things, especially if they're a little older, folks lose the key first or break the key switch or whatever they do to the key switch, so they start messing with the wiring in here, and then you end up with a hack job, especially if you have a few generations of hack job. And let me tell you first of all what I did with this and why I did it with this. First thing I did was, if you're familiar with the 300EX, it has a double CDI system. It has a DC CDI, which is, I'm going to use the word less RPM limited, and that's for going forward. And the reason why I'm using the word less, most of these don't let you scream them up to the point where they blow up with a stock CDI unit on it. This CDI is powered by direct current. It runs off the battery. And the other thing about it is it has some interlocks in it. This is a GY6 DC CDI. This is the CDI from the 300EX. So the first thing I decided was I'm not going to fool around with the CDI from the 300EX. I buy these for, I don't know, 15 bucks. They come with the matching coil. See the nice bright orange matching coil. I get them for about 15 bucks. eBay, they're known as GY6 12 volt DC CDI. Take a look at some of my other videos. You'll find them out there. Or if you want, you can, put one of these Gasolis on there. So that was the first thing I did. Oh, but once again, there are two CDIs. One of them, the second one, is an AC CDI, and it just uses this to go in reverse. It does not start on this thing, and this is extremely rev limited so that you don't go flying backwards at 100 miles per hour, or however fast it'll go if it weren't rev limited in reverse, and kill yourself. It's kind of a safety thing. So that was the first thing I decided, that I'm not going to mess around with that. So given that I wasn't going to mess around with that, I even wrote you guys a little thing here. Once again, decoding and rebuilding a hacked Honda 300EX wiring harness. The first thing to do is get a general idea of where the bunches of wires go to. Like, if you can figure out before you rip it off the bike that a bunch of wires go out to where the headlight is, if you can kind of like get them together, put a tie wrap around them or tape them all together, that's a good thing. Key switch, same thing. CDI plugs, if you could kind of isolate those before you take the CDI off or rip everything apart. The ignition coil, the starter, the battery, wires coming out of the engine. So that's the first thing. If you guys get a general idea where the wires are coming from, that makes this whole decoding a lot easier. The second thing you got to realize is you got to make the CDI happy. So whether I'm using this big old monstrosity, which might have interlocks that I don't want to figure out, or I'm using this thing, which is a lot easier to figure out, you want to make that happy. And lastly, and by the way, once that's happy, it'll spark, and then what you have to do is make your starter loop happy. So this is your general, and I'm just going to put it on the screen here. So what I'm trying to do as I look at my CDI is to get all these things happy, which means I want to get the blue and white eventually hooked up to the engine pulse generator, right? See, pulse generator, very happy. I want to get the green to ground, and by the way, you got a million connections to ground, so as you're looking at the wiring harness, you should be seeing that. In this case, also the black and white wire would go to ground. Though also beware, though I have a bunch of locations on here, right, which is all well and good, you should also beware that the colors on some of the wiring harnesses aren't exactly the same. What you want to worry about more are the locations. Like from a location point of view, this black and white wire, given its current location, what that thing does is that's an on and off switch. This gray wire is actually going to power, right? Yellow and black eventually wants to go to the coil, green to the coil for ground, and so forth. So you really gotta pay attention to where your wires go to make your CDI happy. So that's one thing. When it comes to getting power to your CDI, spend some time tracing the wires, and it turns out you got this red wire here that does all kinds of interesting hookups and so forth, but eventually it puts power into your switch, right? So power goes into the switch on red and white, and it comes out on black, pure black. That's a bit of a surprise. I personally would not have it come out as a pure black. I would have it come out with, I don't know, red with a black stripe or something like that. But that's the way Honda did it. And by the way, once it comes out as black, it goes into the wiring harness and does all these interesting splits. That black wire is hot, but you can see it hooks up there, hooks up down there, right? I mean, they got like 1,000 things coming off this black wire after it comes out of the switch. So once again, battery goes to the red wire, goes to the switch, comes out as a black wire, goes into this thing, or on its way to this thing, has a bunch of splits that goes to all over the place. Okay, once the power comes into here, it goes to one side of the starter switch. Bang. That black wire goes to the starter switch. The other side, you can see yellow and red. That actually goes to the starting solenoid. Right, see it right here, right up to the starting solenoid. And that's one side of the starting solenoid. The other side of the starting solenoid goes to ground. Got it right there. So, when you turn on the key switch, it powers this thing up, and you push this button, powers this thing up, and closes the contacts. What else needs to happen? Well, one side of the connector needs to go to your starter, which is what this wire does, and the other side needs to go to your battery, and you see it down there on the battery. Once again, I mentioned this guy. Here's the wires coming out of the engine, right? Blue and white. Goes over to the CDI. Blue and white, blue and yellow. Chinese do things a little interesting. Green ground, right? I ran that into the ground wire right here, right? And you can see right there. So yellow, ground, red, green and white. So now this thing's happy, or happier, because it has ground, right? It has a pulse generator. It has power, right? When I turn this switch on, it gives this thing power, right? And the last thing is, see the black and yellow? And the green, that's coming from here, going to my spark. So, what do I not have? When I push this button, there are no interlocks saying I'm in neutral or anything else. When I push this button, it's going to make this contactor close, which is going to make the starter go round. When I turn this key on, it's going to put power to my ignition coil. So keys on, got power to my ignition coil, got power to here, push the button, it engages my contactor, my engine starts, hopefully. I also set this up and I ran the wires. These are the headlight wires, white, blue, green. So those do this headlight here, and I deliberately hooked that up so I can show you with the switch that it works. I bought a spare ignition switch for this because the starter was no good. Turns out on the 300EX, while they were hacking things, they must have hooked up this switch to turn over the starter, and I don't think they had the coil in between, because the starter switch from the original one, I replaced it, was completely melted inside. It was all destroyed. So I think what they did is they took this out of there and bypassed it. So I bought a second handlebar switch for a 300EX, and it turns out you can't just get this little starter switch. So I bought a second one, and the starter switch wasn't in very good shape. So I had to take it all apart, which was, by the way, extremely difficult. Clean the contacts and put it all back together again. So at the moment it's functioning, but how long it's going to be functioning is an interesting discussion. But just quickly, I got my battery right there. It's actually my capacitor right there. I got the battery charger charging it through this light bulb. So I got 12 volts on the system here, right? So what happens when I turn on the lights, when I turn on the ignition, boom, right? I just sent 12 volts to this switch, and I got the headlight on, and right, I could go high-low with the headlight. So that's hooked up, or I can just turn it off. Bang. That's good. Remember, I still got 12 volts to the switch, so when I push this button on that yellow wire, it's going to make this engage, and that should fire up my engine. That difficult, huh? It's really hard. So it took me a little while to get this all laid out. It's easy to come up with the shortcut. The shortcut is, once again, this is a GY6 CDI unit. Basically the same thing that's in this box. Right, and what do I have to do? I have to hook up my blue and white that goes to the pulse generator. The 300EX just so happens that it's got a ground wire coming off that pulse generator area. So I set it up with two wires going to the pulse generator, ground and the blue and white. Need a ground to make my spark go. And also a ground to come back and power this thing. So I put the big clamp on that. Notice the nice green wire. I need ground to go to one side of my ignition coil. They're using a black yellow here. I went into yellow brown because it was convenient. And once again, these two go to my ignition coil. Red goes to power, and I went with the black for battery ground. So there you are. I started off like this, then I said, you know, I really would like the handlebar switch to work. So I hooked that up, and you can see it works quite well. This is one of those Chinese switches, Chinese quad ignition switches. It's kind of like this ring on the outside is made out of plastic. It's kind of junk. That's why they only cost like $5 each. Given that this switch has its issues, I did order a Chinese one as backup. Actually, I have a couple of them coming in. They're cheap. They're like less than $10 each also. But you get what you pay for. They are kind of weak and flimsy. What did I do with... What's interesting is I did buy... This was an eBay 300 EX handlebar switch, lights and all, and you can see it wasn't in very good shape. You see the dum-dum there. Turns out that though the starter switch wasn't working on it, I was able to get in it and fix it. I took this is the one that was originally on the bike, the starter switch. I had to dig all this epoxy out and then take it all apart, and once again this one was melted inside. The good thing about the one I bought on eBay, by the way, it was only $20, but it came with all the plugs, and I decoded things and said, oh, the blue and the white and the green, these go out to the headlight, and sure enough they do. That made life easy. This thing has a major plug which goes into the harness, so that's all still usable. These are the wires that plug into the motor, and I think they're using these for safety purposes. So it didn't take me very long. No, and two of them, let's see. These two actually go to the, excuse me, I misled you. These two actually go into the ignition switch, and these go to the various lights. Are you in neutral, and are you reverse? The neutral and reverse light switch, right? So basically, this bundle was between the headlight and dashboard bundle. Right? Oops. My headlight and dashboard bundle. Right there. This plugs into the major wiring harness. And these are the wires I kind of hacked up on the... I did a lot of this hacking up here. I'm not sure why, but there were these extra 2 wires that my harness didn't have that go up by the key switch, and I looked in the diagram, and sure enough they do go by the key switch. One of them is ground. The second one's green also, and I'm not quite sure what that does for a living. Or it doesn't go by the key switch, it goes by the ignition switch, the handheld ignition switch. So I'm not quite sure what that story is. I'm not using it there, so it really doesn't matter to me. So what did I show you here? I showed you that you can figure out how to get through your wiring system, how you can make it work, how you can make it start and run, how you could get the lights working, all that stuff. I did not hook up the interlocks. If this thing is in gear and you push this button, right, assuming the switch is on, if this thing is in gear and you push this button, it's going to start. Right? If it's in reverse or gear or anything else, it's just going to start right up. No interlock on that. This thing has no rev limiter for reverse, so not only is it going to start up, if you have it in reverse and give it it's going to go backwards as fast as the carburetor allows it to go backwards. There is no ignition to slow it down. The CDI safety isn't going to slow you down. Anyway, this is a long video. I hope it helps you guys. Folks, I need you to keep your feet down, keep your heads up. I want to thank you all for watching and commenting and subscribing. I get asked a lot of questions on this, and I think it's easier to show you guys than tell you guys. So I think I'm going to start leaning toward that, because sometimes I don't mind answering questions, but some of them take a long time to type out. So Cody in particular, I think I'm going to show you the answer to your question. You asked if both green wires on this go to ground. The answer is yes. On top here, they got red and black. This plug isn't exactly the same as your standard plugs for these things. Standard plugs should really look more like this. So this is the only loose Sony type CDI I have, and it didn't have really the right plug on it, so I wanted to double check some of these colors before I answered your question. I know both greens go to ground because I checked them and they're tied together. I know red is power, so that's not an issue. I know the yellow goes out to your spark coil. I know the blue and white goes to your pulse generator. It's just this extra black. I wanted to take a quick look at a wiring diagram before I said anything to it, because I'm not sure what plug you have on your CDI, if you have this kind of plug or the other kind of plug. So anyway, folks, once again, I want to thank you all for watching and commenting and subscribing. Remember to keep your feet down, keep your heads up, and please get out there and enjoy all your days. Bye now, folks.